Hey, you ever wonder if histamine intolerance is a real health problem that people have? Is it just the same as having allergies, or is there something else to it? Well, today we're going to break down histamine intolerance. This is something I've been working with patients who have for decades now. I don't want to just get into the basics of histamine intolerance, what it means, where it comes from, and some strategies you can use to work with it. So first, histamine intolerance is a real health condition. Basically, it comes from one of two pathways. The primary one is that the body knows what to do with histamine, meaning get rid of it when it is produced in the body. But in some people, the way of getting rid of it or the pathways of getting rid of it are slowed down for a number of reasons. So that can be one of the reasons. And then there is also what we might call a supply side problem, where maybe the body can do okay with regular amounts of histamine, but we have maybe some hyperreact triggering of the production of histamine. And so then we have an imbalance in supply and removal. So again, it's either the removal is a problem or the supply is too excessive, or maybe a little bit of both. So you might say, well, I have a sense, or maybe you have allergies and you feel like, well, I get respiratory problems when I have allergies, or I get just a stuffy nose, or my skin gets itchy or something like that. You can get all of those things with histamine intolerance, but you want to keep in mind that beyond that, you can get skin rashes. You can have a lot of digestive problems because histamine is used in the digestive tract as a signaling molecule, and it's also irritating to the digestive tract. And you can have blood pressure changes due to histamine excess or histamine removal problems, changes in your heart rate, even the development of some types of heart dysrhythmias or arrhythmias, you might call them. So histamine intolerance can present in classic allergic ways, and then it can present in non-typical allergic ways, which is a very important thing to consider while we're thinking about histamine intolerance. But from the science and from my experience, how could this happen specifically? And probably more important, what can we do about it? So the first one would be on the supply side. So remember, we said there's this balance of supply of histamine and removal of histamine. Now you might think, and I'm a person who has allergies myself, so you might think, well, I don't like my allergies. They're very, discomforting, and they create a lot of symptoms I don't want. So why would the body make histamine? Like, it seems like it's just a big problem. Well, histamine is used as a neurotransmitter in your brain. If you did not have histamine in your nervous system, you would literally not be alive. So it's kind of important there. Histamine is used in other pathways in the body as well. And so it's produced naturally as a part of the way that our body works. But like everything in our body, there is a balance to it. And so we're supposed to have the right amount of histamine to run all of the processes that it does, but we're also not supposed to be unable to get rid of it. We're also not supposed to have too much coming in. So on the supply side, the first thing that we think of clinically when somebody has histamine intolerance picture is, let's take a look and let's do maybe some labs and some history, etc. First, to see if there are markers in the labs that might indicate that they're indeed having more histamine production. Now, there are some direct and some indirect measurements. These are getting better in the labs, but they are, like all laboratory tests, subject to, limits of sensitivity and specificity, etc. But the next step then, beyond these gross measurements in the labs and looking at your history, and keeping in mind that you don't always have to have a respiratory problem, or you don't also have maybe itchy skin, but you might develop rashes that are unusual, or you might have joint swelling. That's another histamine problem. You might have sleep disturbances. That's another histamine problem. As I mentioned, you might have aggravation of PVCs or other types of heart dysrhythmias. That's another histamine sign. Not the only reason that happens, but one of the reasons that happens. So the history leads you to then saying, well, are there known and unknown allergens reactions that are going on. So quickly, what is an allergen? An allergen is anything that the body perceives as an invader that generally it shouldn't perceive as an invader. So it's an immune system mistake and an overreaction to something that comes along. That could be pollen, that could be mold or a mycotoxin, that could be a fragrance, that could be a food, it could be all sorts of things, right? So the first thing when we're asking people questions is, do you have a history of asthma, allergy, hay fever, any other, do you have food allergies that you can't eat shellfish, something like that? So that's the first layer. That's the known category. And they'll say, yeah, when I was a kid, I had really bad hay fever and they said I had grass allergies or whatever. And then I kind of grew out of that. And maybe now they don't have that, but they have other things like they have joint pain or asthma or something. Then they may say, oh yeah, there's 3 foods that if I eat them, I have to keep an EpiPen because I'll have an anaphylactic allergic reaction. Well, it's pretty high grade. You usually know about those. So, whatever it is, shellfish or, avocados or something like that. So those are all the known ones. The other thing is, are there things that you don't have a big time allergic reaction where you might need an EpiPen, but you have just a irritation reaction, such as you eat a particular food that you've narrowed down through trial and error, and that food does not cause you to, have your throat close up or have anaphylactic symptoms, but it causes you to have other inflammatory symptoms. It makes your joints swell. It makes your digestive system go off in some way. It triggers dysrhythmia in your heart. That can be maybe an allergic sensitivity, which is in the same category and can trigger histamine intolerance on the supply side. Then the final area that needs to be considered, which may be in the history and maybe you don't know about, would be, do you have mast cell disorder family, mast cell activation syndrome, etc.? Because the mast cells are part of a 4-part quartet of cells led by the mast cells that release inflammatory mediators for the immune system. And when you have mast cell activation syndrome, they do that too much. So histamine is one of the things that comes along with mast cell activation. So if we go, and you could be anywhere on the spectrum with histamine intolerance, you could know all sorts of things that you're allergic to, sensitive to, and you've been told you have mast cell activation syndrome. We already know a whole lot about that. Or you could say, I don't know. I've never had any of that checked. I don't know if I'm allergic to anything. I've never eaten anything and had anaphylaxis, but other than that, I don't know. But I do get these rashes. I get this GI upset. I get joint swelling, on and on with all the symptoms. In either case, but of course, if someone already knows a whole bunch of things they're allergic to, there's less testing involved for confirmation. If they don't know anything, there's more testing involved. But then what we're going to do is to look at some markers and some, especially allergy testing, and see what else we can find that might be a trigger to make the cells that make the histamine overproduce. That's the production side. Now, in a second, we'll get to what would we test and all of that. But that's kind of how we look at the supply side, the production side. So the next thing is, let's say the production's fairly level, but we have trouble getting rid of it, the removal side. Well, your body not only has one pathway to get rid of histamine out of the body, it has 3 pathways to get rid of histamine out of the body. And there's different ways that the removal pathways of histamine, these 3 main pathways, can become impaired so that even if you have a relatively normal supply side, you don't get rid of the histamine fast enough and you have histamine intolerance symptoms. And so quickly, and then later we'll get into maybe some more specifics about this, but some of them are that the elimination pathways are simply slow because they have either been overburdened, or these pathways, the enzymes that run these pathways, are nutrient sensitive. They need coenzymes that are nutrients. And if we use the pathway a lot and it gets low in the nutrient, we slow the pathway down. That's another way that that happens. Some people will have single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, in the enzymes, the genes that create the enzymes to help you out. So you may be going along and then genetically you have a little damage in the area. So it doesn't shut off the enzyme, but it decreases the functionality of that enzyme. Well, that's a big problem too. So when we think about it, we could have a combo of both just slow elimination and maybe a little genetic trouble, because what turns on the genetic trouble are epigenetic signals. Epigenetic signals can be things like nutrient depletion, inflammation in the body, chronic infections, toxin exposure, all sorts of things can turn on these epigenetic signals that would then slow down your histamine removal. And you can have this with people where you take somebody like me, where I've been allergic and had histamine problems my whole life. I'm not surprised by that. But you take people where they get to 25, 35, maybe 40 years old, they've never seemed to have histamine problems, now they do, and they wonder why. Well, that's a classic epigenetic pattern where your exposures in your life have been beating on your genome and turned on some of these genes that slow your histamine removal down. So sometimes it's both of those at the same time. Another one that often isn't talked about is pathway competition. So, for example, in a little bit, we'll talk about the pathways, but in the long, what we call the long pathway that starts with HMNT, histamine and methyltransferase, and helps histamine get out, there's two big competitors. An intermediate in that pathway is monoamine oxidase, but other stuff goes through monoamine oxidase. The hormone estrogen and estrogen metabolites partly metabolize through monoamine oxidase. Your excitatory neurotransmitters, a lot of them go through monoamine oxidase. There's other stuff goes through monoamine oxidase. So it's not just histamine trying to get out, it's all these other guys. So that's competition. Down below, there is an aldehyde dehydrogenase step to try and get rid of histamine aldehyde. And that can be competed with by internal problems like fungal infections and stuff, but external things like alcohol consumption, because they both are trying to get through the same thing. So that's pathway inhibition. This is why sometimes people will have allergy problems, sensitivities to histamine, whatever, but then they don't realize and they go out and they have some alcohol, so it's competing, and then suddenly they go into excessive amounts of histamine problems that before would have only been 25% of the problem. So that's pretty good too to remember. And then in the removal, the other thing that can cause a problem is, as we said earlier, a supply side hyperactivity that sort of runs into a pathway overload. So what would that be? Well, the elimination pathways the enzymes are good, but they can only process so much histamine at a time. And you've got three ways to process histamine, three different pathways. But if we have excessive exposure, let's say it's pollen time and that pollen's your nemesis, that's overexposure. Let's say you have mast cell activation or a mast cell disorder, that can be overexposure. So it's sort of like a collision in the middle where you are going to have a pathway that slows down because I put too much stuff into the pathway. And all of these can happen at the same time. So at this point, most people will say, okay, logically, I guess that makes sense. We've got reasons why histamine get triggered and go up. We've got natural ways in the body to get rid of histamine, but sometimes we can imbalance the supply and the elimination, and then I get all of the histamine symptoms. Wonderful. What can I do about that? Well, the first thing to remember, and if you have histamine problems, you already know this, but just to say it out loud, when histamine overwhelms your system, so if you're histamine sensitive or you have a lot of allergies, etc., that can become a life-threatening problem. We've all heard of or seen someone have an allergic anaphylactic reaction, a type 1 reaction, where they might need epinephrine in an EpiPen or Benadryl injected or something. And this is where the reaction is so big that you have a respiratory compromise, and it can lead to even cardiac compromise as well, in addition to all the other bad things. So the first thing is do no harm. And if you have progressive allergic phenomenon, make sure you talk to whoever your healthcare provider is. And if it's bad enough, they'll have you carry an EpiPen and maybe other things too. That's kind of up to you and them to decide how bad the problem is. But first off, please be safe. Don't mess around with excess histamine, especially when it gets worse. Let me just tell you, in my case, I had literally allergies from my earliest memories and based on what my parents tell me, basically from a short time after I was born. So pretty allergic my whole life. I am now not young. I never had a life-threatening, I had bad reactions. I would get wheezy, I would get itchy, my joints would sell all those problems. But I never had a life-threatening reaction in my whole life until I was probably in my middle 40s, about 20 years ago. And then it built up to the point where I had my first anaphylactic reaction. And I only tell you that so that you understand that just because you didn't have an anaphylactic reaction to histamine intolerance before doesn't mean it's not going to happen now. We think, oh, well, you would have been, that level of reactive from childhood. Not always. So please keep in mind, just because you haven't had a bad problem in the past, it could be in the future. So again, first, do no harm. Talk to your healthcare provider, get whatever preventive or reactive medications, whether it's an EpiPen or Benadryl or whatever it is you guys decide, do that first. Okay. But beyond that, then what do we do beyond not dying and safety? Because there's many other levels here. So the first thing then, and I told you we talk about the specifics on supply side, breaking them down. The first thing then on supply side is what are my known allergens and sensitivities, and then what don't I know about? And most of the people, not everybody, but most of the people I've talked to as patients who are having these problems maybe had some testing or none. And so then we look at, well, what wasn't tested? But what's another thing about testing? How long ago was it tested? So remember the story about me I just told you where I had bad allergies my whole life, but it wasn't until I was about 45 I had my first anaphylactic reaction to an allergen. Well, if you looked at my testing for allergies from when I was 10 years old, because that was probably the second time I got tested, some of those triggers would be the same as they were when I was 45 or 65 years old. But the ones that later became anaphylactic, tried to kill me, didn't come up on my earlier tests because I wasn't sensitized to them. So if I see somebody was tested for allergies more than 5 years ago, it might be a good time to upgrade and do a new test with that. So on the supply side, what are the big areas you can look at? Well, the first would be, whether an allergist does it, they're going to do it a little bit differently in specialty care. Sometimes we would draw and do IgE, like Edward panels, which is the marker for type 1 allergy to a substance. And you can do a panel that includes local inhalant allergies. So that's regional in the US, and that's trees and grass and whatever that grows, in the Pacific Northwest or wherever you live. Then you can do molds. Now that's not mycotoxin testing, but you can test for mold allergen, which is very important to do. You can then test for other individual, pollens and specific things if you want to do that. You can also test for food IgE, which in people with histamine intolerance, although not a lot of them come up, sometimes some do. And then there's things that might be common in your life like animals, cats, dogs, whatever animals you are around. If you live in a rural area or you live on a farm, you work on a farm, it's often really good to be tested for, large horses and cows and stuff beyond domestic animals. So all of that can feed in. So all those things can be tested for it. And somebody with really mysterious triggers and things, again, those are the big bad reactions, the IgE reactions. So usually we'll start by testing those. Now, then you might say, well, what about other types of reactions that may be triggering histamine and other inflammatory stuff that are not anaphylactic? It might lead, though, to more histamine than I want. Those we often look at additional to what I just said with IgE. If someone's real bad, we might do a mediator response type testing, an MRT type test, which is a blood test that looks at histamine and other inflammatory mediators, hence the name mediator response test. And you can order that just for foods. You can order it for foods and some plants and herbs that you might eat. You can order that for chemicals, preservatives. There's a lot of things you can order that for. And that can be very helpful too. And what you need to remember is it's a different type of test, but it's still looking at the supply side. And then there's other things you can do to look at the supply side. Now, the other thing that we might look at on supply side would be, are there other triggers that maybe we haven't looked at? Well, beyond foods, another trigger that's very common because it's in the air would be mycotoxins. So I said you could test for mold IgE or IgG, That's good. You can do that. But mold then gives off something called mycotoxin, which is a biotoxin, and that you can test for directly or indirectly through immunoglobulin testing or whatever. But a mycotoxin and a mold IgE test are not going to look at the same thing. One is the reactivity of you to the mold spores itself. The other is your reactivity or presence of the mycotoxin, which is a poison. It's a immune derailer. It does all sorts of bad things. That's another one that we can add on the supply side there. So then if we look at that side, the first thing that we want to do as far as what do we do about it is know who your enemies are, get tested to the degree that you can. And then if you're real bad off or helping those things isn't doing all of it, consider working with a healthcare provider who does mast cell activation problems. So that's a whole other talk. We have a lot of content on that up on the YouTube channel. Now, there's things that you can do. The first thing is reduce exposure. Well, obviously, if I'm allergic to a food that's going to kill me, I don't eat that food anymore. And when you go to a restaurant, you let them know, I have an anaphylactic reaction to whatever the food, so don't cross-contaminate you. The next thing, though, reducing exposure would be things like working with air filters. And if you only have one air filter you can use, put it in your bedroom because that's where you probably spend the most time. Now, if you work in a closed office or you work from home in a closed office, that's the next place that you want to have an air filter. The ion type air filters, not the name brand, but the ionic trap type air filters that you can get, or HEPA filter with an ion grid, those are really good. And you can do some research on that, but air filtration's great. The other thing, if you have airborne things like pollens or dog and cats or whatever, if it's something like you're very allergic to a cat that you pet the cat, usually, washing the areas that you pet the cat with is enough. But if you're an airborne inhalant, so the trees or the grass or whatever, you may have to, let's say you've been working in the yard, you may have to take a bath or a shower and make sure you get it all out of your hair, your eyes, ears, nose, throat, your body, off your skin, and change clothes and then wash the other clothes. Because if you walk around with pollen-laden clothing and it's trapped in your mucous membranes or your hair, you're going to have more and more reactions. So it's very important for some people to do that. If you can't avoid airborne inhalant allergens and you have to be, cutting a hedge or something like that, wear a mask that can trap those things. Or let's say that there's some pollens, but also maybe mold spores and other stuff, and you're going to have to go and clean out, a room that's very dusty or a storage room or so anything where stuff's set for a while. That is a huge area where those things go. So you really want to wear a mask for that. And then, of course, after you're done, you want to wash off and change your clothes as well. Now, other things that you might do that may be helpful beyond your emergency drugs like epinephrine and Benadryl, which is an H1 blocker, histamine type 1, and then you might use an H2 blocker together with Benadryl if it's real bad, and then you might use steroids if it's really, really bad. The other would be mast cell stabilizers on the supply side. So that would be things like cromolyn. Cromolyn is a drug, but it comes from a flower, and it's the flavonoid part of the flower. Cromolyn is given as a nasal spray. It's given as an inhalation, either a nebulizer or a inhaler that you might use. It's also used orally as a liquid or a pill. And the thing with cromolyn is it slows your mast cells down, but it takes a while to work. You have to take it a lot of times during the day. So it's not a good acute use thing, but it can calm it down. Other things would be things like bioflavonoids, which cromolyn is a drug bioflavonoid, but things like hesperidin methylchalcone or hesperidin chalcone is a preparation of the flavonoid hesperidin to make it absorb better. Quercetin chalcone is another one that absorbs better. Any of your bioflavonoids, but you have to take them repeatedly and consistently in order to really work very well. Now, what about on the removal side? Well, when we get to the removal side, what we're talking about there are three big pathways. So we'll start with the easiest one because it only has one step. That's acetylation of histamine. This goes through N-acetyltransferase or NAT enzyme, and that has one primary cofactor, and that's vitamin B5, pantothenic acid. Pantothenic acid in a lot of, now This is not medical advice. This is what we do. You talk to your healthcare provider about doses. But generally, pantothenic acid or vitamin B5, you have to take in the beginning or during allergy season, you have to take usually 500 to 1,000 milligrams 2 to 3 times a day. And then you back off over time. So it does take quite a bit with vitamin B5, but that helps. That's like the relief valve. So another one that's very popular because now we have supplements for it specifically is DAO or diamine oxidase. It's a relative of monoamine oxidase we talked about earlier. And so DAO, you can either take DAO enzyme. It works largely in the GI tract, but it does work elsewhere in your body. The minerals and vitamins that support it include vitamin B6, copper, and vitamin C. And so DAO support can be very helpful. And then there's also some probiotics that can be helpful in the gut in reducing histamine. And then finally, the long pathway or HMNT, the best thing to do is work backwards. So it ends with the aldehyde step, and that is helped by vitamin B1 and B3. The next step above it is monoamine oxidase, which is B6, vitamin C, and magnesium. Next one above that is a methylation step. So that's B12 and folate that help with that. So that one sort of you want to work backwards with. So those are ways to help the removal side. Now, the other thing you might do in a preventive or investigative manner, you can test single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs on a genomics panel. And some of those SNPs are related to these elimination pathways. And the bottom line with that is if they are positive, meaning you have some, homozygous or heterozygous SNP at your enzymes that help you get rid of histamine, which is not uncommon with histamine intolerance. What mostly that means is you need to reduce the stressors that are going to turn the SNPs on, and you also need to then kind of overfeed that system. So if you have SNPs in the N-acetyltransferase, the NAT, you need more B5, vitamin B5, than the average person does. All right. Well, I know that was a little bit longer than our normal talk, but it was a really good question about histamine intolerance, and I really wanted to break down the stages of what it looks like, what to do about it investigatively, and what to do about it from a treatment point of view. Thank you very much. I'm Dr. A. Please subscribe, like, comment, share, do all the stuff. Community is growing. We really appreciate you guys. Check out some other videos we'll post here, and check out on the YouTube channel our playlist because we have a lot more information on all this. Thank you. See you next time.